Good afternoon. Welcome to our final session here for NASA and the Rise of Commercial Space. This session is entitled Creating a Space Economy. So whereas last week we talked a lot about kind of the historical context of this, where commercial space kind of evolved, kind of how we got to today. Today we're really going to turn it over and look at the present here with lots of great talks. I'm Brian Odom. I'm the acting NASA Chief Historian. Again, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you all for going through the hurdle there to get in. Look forward to hearing what should be an engaging and very insightful discussion here. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ken Davidian, who's going to tell you a little bit about what we did last week and some of the context that was added there. Ken, if you would, go ahead and take it away, man.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Brian, and welcome to everybody. As Brian just said, I think it was absolutely a great 2 days last week, and we're in for another great third day right now. As he said, I was just going to spend a couple minutes talking about things that we talked about last week, and I'm not going to give a total recap, but what I wanted to do was to be able to explore a couple of more ideas that I've had since last week, especially based on what I heard from folks. And so I wanted to just, provide some more reflections. And what I'm showing here on the screen is I've got a series of photos of me thinking great thoughts, and there I am. So here are some of the great thoughts that I've thought in the last week. So, some of the observations last week, one made was that companies must intend to be profitable to be considered commercial, and that's the level of analysis. We talked about levels of analysis last week, and that's talking about level of analysis of the organization, whereas I was talking about levels of analysis of markets. So that could be a totally great characteristic of companies to be commercial. So I thought that wasn't inconsistent with what I thought, and like I said, I think there's a lot of room for a lot of different perspectives. One of the questions that came out from Jen Gustetic actually was what constitutes a space industry, because she was saying how there's all these different companies that they deal with that don't necessarily deal with space, and that's a great question. It talks about who the companies are, and also not much as what they do, but a little bit what they do. So what I've done in the past is I've said, there's this core set of industries, spaceports, launch vehicles, and in-space vehicles that can include suborbital vehicles that cross the Kármán line, or orbital vehicles and capsules and on-orbit habitats. And this could be considered a core space industry. But obviously, you've got a lot of space-specific industries, whether it's power systems or propulsion systems or space specialties that tie into those other industries that also could be considered part of the space industry. And of course, you've got all the support vehicles and other business support specialties and other industries that support space that surround that core capability. And then if you expand the list of communities and industries that are involved as well, you include, of course, everything to the raw materials of material, labor, and finance and data, as well as going downstream into the retail services of selling tickets or providing hospitality to demonstrated markets. So these could all be also part of the space industry. But these are all related to the financial relationships that companies have. There's a whole set of groups and communities that deal with non-financial relationships, like governments, both foreign and domestic at the local, state, and national level. There are trade organizations and other international organizations. So there's this whole slew of industry segments, and then down to companies that could be considered part of the space industry. So that's a really great question, and I think a really great distinction. And one thing that L.K. Kubendran mentioned was that his definition of commercial is that NASA is not the only customer. So in my terminology from last week, when I was talking about markets being considered commercial depending on the level of strength of their variation, selection, and retention forces of the evolution motor of change, this would mean that the retention force cannot be zero. It must be non-zero. And so, our commercial organizations operating in non-commercial marketplaces, what happens is if you take those three axes of the variation force, the selection force, and retention force, which are the three forces of the evolution model, and you put them onto a Cartesian coordinate system or a Euclidean system like this, you can see you end up with a three-dimensional axis. And my initial proposition was that the presence and strength of all three evolution forces are positively related to the characteristics associated with commercial. And the variation force is sort of related to the innovation sources. Selection force is related to the funding sources, and the retention force is related to demand forces. But what happens? Oops, I went the wrong way. So one of the main questions is, do all three forces have to be non-zero for it to be considered commercial, or can you have a commercial market if one of the forces was zero? And so we actually have that kind of situation where, like, NASA is doing a great job of stimulating innovation, and so there's a strong variation force through NASA funding, and a lot of other parts of the government, DARPA, Air Force, through AFWorks or InQtel and stuff, are providing a lot of stimulation to the selection forces, in addition to the private market here in the U.S. of finance. But there's really not a whole lot going on in the retention force. So we're kind of stuck on that XY plane of a monopsony. We haven't been able to, lift out of that base plane of this Cartesian coordinate system. And so, what are the implications of this? NASA is not allowed by law to advertise. So market creation, it seems to be what's lacking. Other than human suborbital space tourism, which has 600 tickets sold for Virgin Galactic, presumably with almost as many independent sources of demand, almost as many independent customers, I don't know if we can say that there's a really strong retention force or demand force in many other industry segments. So it's something to think about. And then ultimately, it got me thinking, I saw this headline on the right-hand side, where Europe went wrong in its vaccine rollout and why. It says, while Washington went into business with the drug companies, Europe was more fiscally conservative and trusted the free market. This makes you start thinking of, maybe things that are right should be driven by the teleologic force, where it's centrally driven and the government drives it and makes it more efficient, versus things that are privileges, maybe they should be evolution forces because they're less efficient, they have redundant use of resources. So, maybe it depends on what's a right and what's a privilege, which can devolve into an ideological discussion, but maybe certain rights are national defense, national prestige, science and exploration, and these are the justifications for a civil space program. Maybe transportation of freight is a privilege or a right, to facilitate trade, but maybe a privilege falls under the realms of tourism and human transportation, so that should be left to the market forces. That's all I want to say. I know I go a mile a minute, but I want to get off the stage because there's a lot more interesting people to talk instead of me. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brian and say thank you very much. And everybody have a great session.